Today, we actually dive into chapter 8, and we have to buckle up for this chapter as it has so many little nuggets in it. So I'm going to actually split it into about 2 studies just to make sure we get all those good little nuggets that are in there. So we ended chapter 7 thinking about how God was faithful to wait until the very last minute, that he loves us so much that he wanted to extend the time to repent for the evil people of Noah's time. 7 more days on top of 120 years he had already given them, but yet they still didn't. And we can apply that to our own lives, that God's continually waiting for us. And then we also read how the long promised flood finally came to pass, and God was faithful to protect Noah, his family, and all the animals during the flood. So 2 things we'll study today in God's faithfulness to his covenant and the creation of seasons. That's the 2 things we're going to kind of get out of the chapter today. So chapter 8 starts off saying, "And God earnestly remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him on the ark." Again, I find myself wondering how our mighty God could forget something, when it says remember. But when Moses writes the Lord's remembering, he does not mean that God forgot about Noah, because God absolutely knows all, and he never loses sight of the facts of this world. Instead, when God remembers, when it says remembers, it means that he acts according to his covenant promises, especially in a way that is evident to his people. So if we remember in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 18, it said, "But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you." So God had made a covenant with Noah to protect him and to reestablish him. And so we can see that God doesn't lie in the first verse of chapter 8, because he says he remembered his covenant and he knew he had to finish carrying it out. He hadn't done that yet. He hadn't totally completed it yet. So I love this because it means that all the covenants that we know that God made with us through Jesus have to come true. He has to take care of them because God is not a liar or a breaker of covenants. And so this example from the Old Testament is a testimony of his faithfulness to his covenants. When he says he'll do it, he'll do it. And this makes me get excited to know that God will also keep each and every covenant with me that I received because of Jesus, what you received because of Jesus. So we saw that, he's a covenant God and he remembered his covenant. So we also see that he started to make the earth whole again. It's interesting to see that the water from the flood came in 3 ways, according to verse 2: fountains of the deep, windows of the heavens, and gushing rain from the sky. So we know that before this time, there was a type of atmosphere that they call the firmament around the earth. And it was a dense, thick, moisture-enriched atmosphere. And creation scientists believe that it is also why people lived longer, as it blocked out a lot of the damage the sun could do to people's bodies. So they lived a lot longer. It had never rained before the flood either. Vegetation was watered by a mist that arose from the ground. According to Genesis chapter 2, verses 5 and 6, you can see it there. We are all well aware of the fact that these underground springs exist, even of our time, right? So then imagine that all the springs across the earth burst open at the same time. The firmament bursts open, and now we see some normal weather patterns we're used to because of these things happening. So there's the 3 ways that it came. So for now, though, we're going to focus on the fact that God is putting all the water back in those places that he has set it to be. So the lakes and the underground springs upon the earth and the creation of seasons have all now begun, right? If the creation scientist theory of firmament is correct, which I have no reason from my study to argue, then weather wouldn't have existed before the flood as we know it. Weather patterns wouldn't have been the same. They weren't necessary. So it seems that the firmament provided everything that man and vegetation needed to live. So the breaking of that firmament has now created the need for seasons, as the firmament is no longer there to hold back the power of the heat of the sun. So as we all know, the heat of the sun is what propels seasons. It can create drought. It can create evaporation for the formations of cloud and precipitations. And this idea that seasons are now created is then resounded in the last verse of chapter 8 that says, "While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease." So in other words, this is where we come into the world where we all know and experience with seasons. The flood that was so powerful that it changed how everything of this earth would live forevermore. Now, when I think about that, I think about the power of this flood. It changed earth forever. It changed how earth functioned forever. And when I think about the fact that sin and the evil of the time caused God to have to make such an adjustment to the earth that even the natural operations of life had to shift, I realize that sin changes history, and sin can cause ripples that affect things all the way to eternity. And this is why we must choose to follow Christ and resist the devil and sin in our lives, because it could be absolutely shifting our entire future and the future generations to follow. Now, as we'll read more of chapter 8 next week, we know that God has promised he won't ever destroy the earth by flood again. But we need to keep in the forefront of our minds that the choices we make, the sin we entertain, or the choice to follow God wholeheartedly, each will have repercussions or benefits into the future. And so it's so important that we choose wisely. So chapter 8 so far reminds us that our amazing God's covenants and his faithfulness to fulfill them. And then it reminds us that our choices can shape whole worlds after us. And so we must make our choices wisely. Come back next week when we dig into chapter 8 a little bit more.